There was a moment, at the turn of the century, when America felt caught between two worlds. The year was 1900, and the nation exhaled in the stillness before dawn, half rooted in the 1800s, half reaching toward something unknown. Gas lamps flickered along quiet streets. The sound of horse hooves echoed against cobblestone. Steam rose from manholes like restless spirits, and yet, somewhere just beyond the horizon, new inventions whispered of progress. Light bulbs waiting to brighten windows, steel frames ready to lift cities higher, and a faint hum of machines that would soon change the rhythm of daily life. This was a world where silence still held sway. Families lit stoves with wood and coal, carried water from pumps, and worked by lamplight long into the night. Rivers carried goods across distant frontiers, while locomotives stretched steel ribbons across the land. And yet, the seeds of modern America were already stirring. Automobiles rumbling to life, cameras capturing ordinary smiles, radios preparing to shrink the world with invisible signals. It was a strange in-between moment. On one side, traditions still clung to the familiar, chores done by hand, children bent over slates in one-room schools, and fields bound by the debts of sharecropping. On the other side, an age of skyscrapers, electricity, and moving pictures was ready to bloom. Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Town Radio. Here, stories move gently, like the glow of a street lamp on a quiet corner, guiding you into rest. Tonight, we drift together into early 1900s America, into the crossroads of past and progress, where yesterday lingers in shadow, and tomorrow waits softly in the light. Settle in. Let the day slip away. The century is about to awaken. At the turn of the century, America was not one country, but many. Bound together by the same flag, yet separated by distance, tradition, and time itself. Step into that landscape, and the contrasts unfold like pages from different books pressed into the same volume. In the Northeast, cities glowed with the promise of progress. Gas lamps burned steadily along wide boulevards, and pipes carried running water into row houses where families gathered at supper tables. The air was thick with the sound of industry, factories clattering with machinery, whistles calling shifts into order, and electric wires humming faintly above crowded streets. These were the places where modernity was settling in, brick by brick, light by light. Travel westward, and the scene changed quickly. In the Pacific Northwest, rivers remained the true highways. Timber floated downstream, boats ferried goods, and towns rose and fell with the rhythm of water. The streets were fewer, the silence deeper, and the lifeline of a family could depend on a sturdy boat more than a road. It was a land that felt older, closer to the frontier, where survival meant leaning on nature's currents as much as on human hands. Farther inland, in the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming, isolation shaped the rhythm of life. Families lived in small cabins, often without electricity or plumbing. Winters pressed against thin walls, and the daily work of farming demanded every ounce of strength from dawn to dusk. Here, the 20th century arrived late, sometimes by years. It was a world tied together not by progress, but by grit, by the echo of an axe against wood, by the warmth of a fire that had to be coaxed to life each morning. And in the South, a different ache lingered. Decades after the Civil War, the land still carried the weight of its history. Sharecropping bound poor families, both black and white, to the soil. The system was cruel. Land rented at a cost too high, seeds borrowed against future harvests, tools tallied in ledgers controlled by landlords who rarely played fair. At the end of a season, debts were greater than earnings, and the cycle began again. For many, it was a life of endless labor with little hope of escape. The South wore progress like an ill-fitting coat, too thin to hide the hardships underneath. One flag flew over all of it, but the lived experience of America in 1900 depended entirely on where you stood. A boy in Boston might walk home under glowing streetlights, his shoes tapping against stone sidewalks, while a boy in Mississippi worked the fields barefoot until sunset, his family bound to another man's ledger. A mother in Chicago might draw clean water from a tap, while a mother in Montana hauled buckets from a frozen pump. The distance between these lives was more than geography. It was years of change unevenly spread across the map. Some Americans were stepping into a new century with gaslight, plumbing, and the hum of machines. Others were still living much as their grandparents had, tied to land, river, and the stubborn weight of the past. Modernity had arrived, but only in pieces. And for those awake enough to notice, it was clear. America was not one world, but many, stitched together loosely, unevenly, beneath the same stars and stripes. In the year 1900, America was not only divided by distance, but also by language, by the words people did not yet have. A dictionary of daily life that feels familiar to us now was still incomplete, waiting for inventions and ideas to give it shape. Imagine standing in a quiet parlor as the evening settles in. A clock ticks on the mantel. A family gathers by lamplight, perhaps reading aloud from a Bible or a worn novel. What you would not hear, not even whispered, are words that feel ordinary today. Radio was not yet common. Movie had not yet claimed its place in conversation. There was no electronics, no tractor, no crossword puzzle to fill a Sunday afternoon. The world had not yet spoken these things into existence because the things themselves were either unborn or still on the edge of discovery. Without radios, there were no voices drifting through the air on lazy afternoons, no broadcasts carrying music into living rooms, no announcer describing a ball game. Without movies, there were no theaters with their warm smell of popcorn, no shared laughter in the dark, as flickering images told a story larger than life. Silence stretched further, and isolation lingered longer. The pace of life was slower, not only because machines had yet to quicken it, but because the very words to describe that future were still missing. Even in matters of the heart and mind, the vocabulary was thin. Terms like psychotic or schizophrenic were either unknown or badly misunderstood. People spoke of madness, melancholy, or nerves, but the scientific language that could explain inner suffering had not yet taken hold. A man might live in torment, a woman might wrestle with unseen pain, and society had only crude labels to offer. Language shapes understanding, and without those words, compassion was harder to find. Social ideas were equally scarce in everyday talk. Feminist was not a word most households would recognize. Propaganda had not yet become a modern tool of persuasion. Even jazz, a sound waiting in the wings of the century, had not been named. Without the word, the music still lived. beating quietly in the neighborhoods of New Orleans, waiting for a name to give it permanence. Think of what that means. That the way people dreamed, argued, and hoped was limited by the vocabulary available to them. Words are more than sounds. They are the handles we use to carry ideas. In 1900, the handles were fewer, and the loads people bore were heavier for it. A nickel coin turns slowly in the palm of a child, but there is no Nickelodeon yet to drop it into. A housewife folds laundry, but the word refrigerator is still foreign. A farmer leans against a fence, but tractor has not entered his speech, and the plow behind him is still pulled by horse. Each missing word is a missing possibility, a shadow of the future not yet made real. And yet, this absence tells its own story. The language of 1900 reminds us how swiftly imagination can expand. Within just a few decades, words like radio, movie, and jazz would carry not only inventions, but entire cultures. They would redefine leisure, art, identity, and even how a nation understood itself. The dictionary of a people grows as their imagination grows. And in those quiet years at the dawn of the century, America stood ready, waiting for the right words to catch up with the dreams already stirring in its soul. At the dawn of the 20th century, America's heartbeat began to quicken with a new rhythm. It was the rhythm of iron striking iron, of furnaces roaring in the night, of steel pouring into molds that would shape the very bones of a new nation. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, the skies glowed orange with the fire of the mills. Entire towns lived in the shadow of smokestacks, where day and night blurred together under a canopy of soot. For those who labored there, the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam became the soundtrack of survival. Steel was more than just a material. It was the spine of progress. Out of it rose the fortunes of men whose names still echo in history. John D. Rockefeller with his oil empires, Andrew Carnegie with his steel mills. Their power stretched far beyond the walls of their factories. They became symbols of what industry could achieve and of what it could cost. To some, they were visionaries, titans who lifted America onto the global stage. To others, they were reminders of the deep divide between gilded wealth and the weary hands that forged it. But steel was not content to remain in the ground or the factory. It began to remake the American city itself. Until then, buildings had grown outward, spreading low across the land. Now, with steel frames rising into the sky, cities began to learn a new language, a vertical grammar. Architects like Louis Sullivan gave form to this ambition, designing structures that climbed 30, even 40 stories into the air. For the first time, the horizon was interrupted not by church steeples or courthouse domes, but by man-made mountains of glass and steel. Step inside one of these buildings, and you would hear the echoes of progress. Rivets hammered into place, beams creaking as they settled, and the hum of an invention just as revolutionary as the steel itself, the elevator. A short ride upward turned impossibility into routine, transforming the way people lived, worked, and dreamed. The skyline became not just higher, but bolder, a declaration that America's cities were no longer bound to the earth. Yet behind the grandeur lay the human cost. Men worked long shifts in blistering heat, their faces streaked with sweat and ash. Sparks leapt dangerously close to tired eyes. Accidents were common, and compensation rare. Still, for many immigrants and farm boys seeking a better life, these mills offered more than wages. They offered entry into the promise of a new century, harsh, grueling, but full of possibility. From the heat of those furnaces came the steel that built bridges to span rivers, rails to stitch the nation together, and towers that reshaped the American imagination. Each beam carried with it both the labor of the nameless and the dreams of the powerful. And so, America found itself with steel in its spine, stronger, taller, more ambitious than before. The fires of the mills lit more than the night sky. They lit a path forward, one that would lead cities higher, faster, and into the modern world. At the turn of the century, American cities did not simply grow upward with steel. They also began to stretch outward, knitting themselves together with bridges, rail lines, and tunnels that carried life in every direction. To walk through one of these cities in 1900 was to hear the steady hum of infrastructure reshaping time and space itself. Bridges became the lifelines between neighborhoods, binding communities that had once been divided by rivers and valleys. In New York, the Brooklyn Bridge stood as a symbol of both engineering genius and human persistence. Completed in 1883, it still towered over the East River like a cathedral of stone and steel cables, carrying not only carriages and wagons, but also the dreams of those who crossed its span. Similar spans began to appear in other cities, testaments to ambition, giving workers a shorter path to factories and families a faster way to markets. Each crossing was more than a feat of engineering. It was a promise that distance could be conquered. And then there were the streetcars, sleek, electric, and alive with the chatter of passengers. They became the veins of the modern city, stitching together homes, workplaces, theaters, and parks. At the clang of a bell and the hum of overhead wires, a car would glide down tracks, carrying clerks in bowler hats, women in long skirts balancing parcels, and children clutching nickels for the ride. With every stop, the city breathed in and out, pulsing with a rhythm that was both mechanical and deeply human. Before the streetcar, most people lived within walking distance of their work. Factories and shops clustered near homes, and neighborhoods pressed tightly together. But with these new lines stretching miles in every direction, families could move outward, settling in quieter streets, leafy suburbs, or rows of modest houses beyond the roar of the factory whistle. For the first time, the working and middle classes had a choice. They could live farther from the center and still remain connected. Convenience was rewriting the map of daily life. Beneath the surface, another revolution was taking shape. Subways, still a novelty at the time, carried passengers through tunnels that seemed to defy nature itself. In Boston, the first American subway opened in 1897, and by 1904, New York followed with its own underground marvel. Imagine the wonder of descending a staircase into the earth, coins in hand, only to emerge minutes later in a completely different part of the city. What once took an hour on foot or carriage could now be covered in 10 minutes. Space was reshaped by time saved, and the city seemed smaller, closer, more intimate. The sounds of this new pulse were unmistakable. The metallic hum of rails, the spark and crackle of electric lines above, the whoosh of air as a train slipped past in its dark tunnel. On the surface, wheels clicked over tracks, horses shied at the sudden clang of bells, and passengers leaned from windows to catch a breeze. For those who had grown up in quieter towns, The energy of it all was overwhelming, a thrum that could be felt in the bones as much as in the ears, yet it was also liberating. The bridges carried hope across waters that once divided. The streetcars offered speed at the price of a nickel. The subways whispered that even the limits of time and distance could be bent to human will. Life was no longer measured only by the length of one's stride or the stamina of a horse. The city itself had taken on a pulse, steady, electric, alive. Convenience, once a luxury, became a quiet revolution. It taught people to dream farther, to settle wider, to move faster than their grandparents ever imagined. And in that hum of wires and rails, America felt a new heartbeat, one that would carry it deeper into the modern century. Night used to fall heavy over America. When the sun slipped beneath the horizon, shadows pressed in close, and families relied on the faint glow of candles, the dim flicker of kerosene lamps, or the soft crackle of a fire. Streets emptied, shops closed, and only the moon or a lantern guided travelers home. But around the turn of the century, something astonishing began to happen. Darkness itself was challenged, and slowly it began to lose. Thomas Edison had been at work for decades, tinkering, refining, pushing against impossibility. By 1900, his invention, the practical incandescent bulb, was no longer just an experiment for laboratories and wealthy patrons. It was creeping into ordinary neighborhoods, one wire and socket at a time. A walk through a city street revealed a transformation. Warm circles of electric light spilling from kitchen windows. Shop fronts illuminated with steady brightness rather than the wavering flame of gaslight. For the first time, night did not mean stillness. It meant possibility. Step into a parlor of the era, and you might see the new miracle firsthand. A light switch clicked with a satisfying snap, and the room bloomed instantly into brightness. Children gasped, laughter bubbled, and even the elders leaned forward, amazed at the reliability of this invisible power flowing through copper wires. There was no trimming of wicks, no oily residue staining fingers, no constant worry of fire. Just light, clean, steady, and endlessly ready. Alongside the bulb came Edison's other marvels. The phonograph spun tinny voices and scratchy melodies into homes. Families gathered close, listening as if ghosts had been captured inside a machine, replaying stories and songs at the twist of a crank. Imagine the wonder to hear a human voice, long absent, suddenly alive again from the horn of a small brass cylinder. It was as if memory itself had been given sound, and then there was the magic of moving pictures. In darkened Nickelodeons, audiences leaned forward on wooden benches as flickering images danced across a screen. Early reels were short, scenes of trains pulling into stations, workers leaving a factory, or vaudeville acts performed with exaggerated gestures. Yet to those first viewers, it was nothing short of breathtaking. The world itself had become a story that could be replayed over and over. A child might laugh at the pratfalls of a comedian, while an older couple clutched hands in awe, realizing they were witnessing the birth of a new art form. These inventions did more than entertain. They redefined the rhythm of daily life. Evening no longer demanded retreat. Light stretched the hours, giving shopkeepers more time, students more chances to read, and families more opportunity to gather. Sound machines filled homes with voices beyond their walls. Flickering pictures offered escape from the grind of labor and poverty, giving working people glimpses of joy, wonder, and connection. The sensory memory of this time is vivid. The sharp click of a switch, the faint hum of filament glowing, the scratch of a phonograph needle, the bubbling laughter of a child watching shadows move on a wall. To live in this age was to feel as though the future had knocked gently at the door and been invited inside. Of course, not every town felt this glow right away. Rural communities still relied on oil lamps and firewood, their nights untouched by Edison's spark. But in cities, in places where wires had already found their way into walls, there was no turning back. Night had become useful, and with that glow, entertainment began to belong to the home itself. The living room transformed into a theater, a concert hall, a place where imagination could stretch far beyond the parlor walls. It was only the beginning, but already America sensed it. The future was arriving, not with thunder, but with a quiet, steady light. At the dawn of the 20th century, most Americans still measured distance by the rhythm of hooves or the patience of a long walk. Roads were dusty in summer, rutted with mud in spring, and frozen solid in winter. Wagons creaked, harnesses jingled, and the world moved at the deliberate pace of the animal pulling the load. And yet, just as Edison's glow had begun to tame the night, another revolution whispered at the edge of the horizon, a machine that would change not only how far people could travel, but how they imagined freedom itself. The automobile, in 1900, was still little more than a rumor. Only a few thousand existed across the entire country, owned mostly by wealthy families who could afford both the machine and the constant repairs it demanded. Neighbors gathered to watch one sputter down a dirt lane, belching smoke and coughing sparks. Some laughed, certain the contraption would never replace a good horse. Others shook their heads, muttering that it was too noisy, too dangerous, too fragile for America's rough roads. Yet in those uncertain starts and stops, something remarkable was stirring. Picture the ritual of beginning the journey. A driver leaned into the hand crank at the front, muscles straining to turn the stiff metal arm. The engine sputtered, coughed, and sometimes refused to catch it all. But when it did, the sound was unforgettable. A staccato rhythm of pistons firing, gravel popping beneath narrow tires, the smell of gasoline sharp in the air. For those who climbed aboard, the sensation was unlike anything a horse-drawn wagon could provide. The ground seemed to fall away more quickly, the landscape slipping past with a new kind of urgency. By 1908, the automobile was ready to step from rumor to reality. Henry Ford's Model T, simple in design but revolutionary in production, rolled off assembly lines that promised affordability for the working family. At $8.25, a steep price but within reach of farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers, it opened the road to those who had never imagined owning such power. The factory itself was a marvel. Parts moving down the line, each worker repeating a single task, efficiency sculpting the future one bolt at a time. For America, this was more than a machine. It was mobility made personal. A horse had limits, hours of endurance, costs of feed, the need for constant care. An automobile, once mastered, could go farther, faster, and with less waiting. Towns once separated by a day's travel became afternoon destinations. Families piled into early touring cars, children perched on laps, picnic baskets wedged beneath seats, and the open road stretched out like a new kind of promise. Not everyone welcomed the change. Horses shied at the noise. Farmers cursed at the ruts torn deeper into country roads. Pedestrians darted nervously across streets, unsure how to share space with a machine that did not tire. But resistance could not hold back the tide. The automobile was more than an invention. It was a symbol. To own one was to belong to a new century, to take part in a story of progress that would soon rewrite the American landscape. The sensory memory of those early cars lingers. The jolt of a crank in cold hands, the sharp pop of backfiring, the thrill of wheels throwing gravel, and the wide eyes of children who chased after them, dreaming of someday gripping the wheel themselves. In the span of just a few years, freedom itself began to take on four wheels. A nation was learning that mobility was not just convenience. It was citizenship. It was independence. It was the possibility of choosing your own direction at the speed of your own choosing. And from that first sputter of rumor to the roar of assembly lines, America understood. Freedom could now be driven. At the dawn of the 20th century, memories were fragile things. They lived mostly in the mind, carried in stories told around kitchen tables or saved in letters folded into drawers. Faces of loved ones faded with time, and moments of joy or sorrow dissolved into recollection alone. But in the year 1900, something remarkable appeared in the hands of ordinary Americans. The Kodak Brownie camera. It was small, affordable, and astonishingly simple. For just $1, anyone could own one. For the first time, photography was not confined to professionals in dark studios with heavy equipment and glass plates. A boy could hold it on his birthday. A mother could snap a picture of her children on the front porch. A family could capture the picnic under a summer oak tree. The Brownie made memory tangible. Imagine the sound of that first shutter, a quiet click, so modest it might almost be overlooked. Yet behind that click was a revolution, a moment of laughter, a tilt of sunlight across a cheek, the curve of a smile, frozen, held, saved. No longer did memory exist only in fragile retellings. It could now be printed on paper, slipped into an envelope, or placed in a shoebox beneath the bed. The process carried its own poetry. Film was sent off to be developed, the anticipation stretching for days or weeks. And when the envelope finally returned, there was magic inside. Square prints with white borders, smelling faintly of chemicals, each one a fragment of life held still. Children crowded around the table to see themselves captured in ways they had never imagined. Parents held the photographs with quiet reverence, knowing that time, so swift and merciless, had been persuaded to pause, if only for a moment. Birthdays, parades, Sunday afternoons on the porch. All these small occasions became permanent. Before the Brownie, only weddings, portraits, or formal sittings were thought worthy of preservation. After it, the ordinary became sacred. A child's crooked grin, the family dog curled at the edge of the frame, the blur of a wagon rolling down a street. All were treasured. Life itself became worthy of remembering, not just milestones, but the in-between days. In rural towns, where isolation often stretched across miles of farmland, photographs became a bridge. A cousin in Kansas could send an image to a sister in Ohio, the faces smiling across distance in a way letters alone could never achieve. Immigrants, too, embraced the camera, capturing their new lives in America and sending images back across the ocean, proof to family that they were alive, hopeful, enduring. There is a sweetness in imagining those shoeboxes tucked into closets or under beds, filled with faded prints. Generations later, a child might discover them, sepia tones, stiff collars, dresses with lace trim, expressions both solemn and playful. Each photograph is a doorway into a moment long gone, a kept memory whispering across the years. The sensory world of this new habit was intimate. The crisp click of a shutter, the faint chemical tang of developed prints, the papery rustle as pictures were passed from hand to hand. More than anything, there was the quiet joy of preservation, the comfort of knowing that today's fleeting glance, today's smile, would not vanish when tomorrow came. With the Kodak Brownie, memory shifted from something fragile and fleeting to something that could be touched, held, and cherished. A century that was racing forward with steel, electricity, and machines also learned to pause and keep its moments. For the first time, America realized memory could be carried not just in the heart, but in a photograph, saved forever in a shoebox under the bed. At the turn of the century, distance was still a weight that people carried. News crossed oceans on ships that took weeks. A message from New York to London traveled in the careful hand of a letter, sealed in an envelope, carried across restless water. For most Americans, the faraway felt impossibly far. Yet, quietly, a new invention promised to change all that. A whisper carried not by horse or rail or steamer, but by the air itself. In December of 1901, Guglielmo Marconi proved what many had thought impossible. From Cornwall, England, to St. John's, Newfoundland, a signal leapt across the Atlantic Ocean. 3 faint dots, just the letter S in Morse code, arrived through the crackle of static. It was a small sound, almost nothing at all, yet it carried the weight of centuries. For the first time, distance itself had been softened, stretched thin by invisible waves moving faster than wind or tide. Imagine that moment. A man bends close to his receiver, the clumsy wires humming faintly, the headphones pressed against his ears. At first, there is only static, like rain falling on a tin roof. Then, suddenly, the pattern emerges. 3 short clicks, distant yet undeniable. A voice of the future had crossed the sea. What had taken days or weeks by ship had arrived in seconds, weightless, unseen, almost miraculous. For ordinary people, the change came slowly, but the imagination of a nation leapt instantly. If dots and dashes could cross an ocean, what else might be possible? Messages from soldiers to families, warnings of storms at sea, the comfort of knowing that loved ones were not quite so far away. It was as though the air itself had learned to carry secrets and promises. The sensory memory of those early experiments lingers. The sharp snap of a spark transmitter, the faint hum of power coursing through copper, the hush of a room where listeners leaned in, waiting for the rhythm of a code to break the silence. Each signal was fragile, easily lost in static, but when it came through, it was like hearing the world exhale. By the years that followed, Radio stations began to dot the map. First maritime, then military, then slowly, quietly, domestic. Operators tapped out messages in Morse, their hands flying over keys with practiced precision. Ships at sea carried aerials stretched high against the sky, their captains comforted by the thought that they were never entirely alone. For the first time in history, the oceans no longer divided the world completely. They were crossed by invisible bridges of sound. There was something almost spiritual about it. The idea that words, stripped down to pulses of electricity, could leap through the air and arrive intact on another shore. This was more than technology. It was intimacy stretched across miles. A mother, a sailor, a merchant, a friend. Each could someday be reached not by waiting weeks, but by listening to a hum and a crackle in the stillness of night. For America, this moment was a promise. The world was drawing closer, even if most people had not yet held the headphones themselves. The whisper of Marconi's signal was enough to remind them that the century ahead would not just be one of steel and engines, but also of invisible threads binding people together. The century was beginning to learn how to listen. On a windswept strip of sand in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the air in December of 1903 was sharp with salt and silence. The dunes were quiet except for the sound of the Atlantic rolling in and the rattle of tools against wood and canvas. There, two brothers from Ohio were about to lift the weight of history off the ground. The Wright brothers were not showmen. They were not backed by grand institutions or wealthy patrons. They were bicycle makers, mechanics with grease on their hands and curiosity in their hearts. What they carried with them to that lonely beach was not a polished machine, but a fragile frame of spruce and cloth, stitched and hammered by their own labor. It looked more like a kite than a vessel of destiny. And yet, on that cold morning, something remarkable happened. As Orville lay on his stomach at the controls, and Wilbur steadied the wing, the engine sputtered to life. Its sound was thin, uncertain, almost embarrassed to be breaking the stillness. The propellers turned, the machine trembled, and then, against all odds, it left the sand. 12 seconds. That was all. Barely more than the time it takes to draw a deep breath. The machine rose into the air, skimming just above the earth, and then settled back onto the sand. 40 feet traveled, a moment almost too brief to notice. Yet in that fleeting arc, centuries of earthbound certainty cracked open. Few people cared at first. The newspapers, busy with politics and war, gave little attention to a flight shorter than the wingspan of a large bird. Some dismissed it as a curiosity, nothing more than a trick with cloth and wind. And yet, for those who had seen it with their own eyes, the moment could never be dismissed. They had witnessed the boundary between the possible and the impossible bend ever so slightly. There is something haunting about that image. The fragile craft lifting from the sand while the cold wind whipped around it. The sky unprepared for what it was being asked to hold. It was not glamorous, not triumphant. It was tentative, almost shy, as though the air itself had to learn how to cradle a human being. But every great leap begins this way. Fragile, brief, easily overlooked. In that modest takeoff, the century's horizon tilted. What was once the stuff of myth, Daedalus, Icarus, wings stitched from imagination, had been reduced to screws, struts, and an engine assembled in a bicycle shop. For the first time, humankind had placed both feet into the sky, if only for the length of a single breath. The sensory memory lingers in imagination. The taut canvas straining against the wind, sand scattering beneath the whir of propellers, the sound of men shouting encouragement over the engine's cough. The flight was over almost before it had begun, yet the echo of it carried forward, louder with every passing year. In that instant, the world grew smaller. Continents that had seemed eternal in their separation were now destined to be drawn closer. The air, once empty, had become a road, and though the first step upon it was faltering, the direction was irreversible. So much of life in the early 1900s was about endurance. Long hours in factories, crowded tenements, fields where sweat carried the day. But here, at the edge of the continent, a new possibility stretched open. It whispered that human beings were not bound only to soil and water. They could rise. They could move in ways their ancestors had only prayed to the heavens for. A mere 12 seconds, easily lost in the noise of history, and yet, in that short flight, forever had begun. In the quiet years just after the dawn of the century, when most of the world still measured certainty by clocks and calendars, something subtle and astonishing began to stir. In a small Swiss patent office, far from the roaring factories of Pittsburgh or the glowing avenues of New York, a young clerk sat at his desk surrounded by papers, ink, and the ticking of a modest clock. His name was Albert Einstein, though in 1905 few beyond his family and colleagues would have known it. The world around him still leaned on Isaac Newton, the great architect of predictable skies. For 2 centuries, Newton's laws had been the foundation of order. The apple falling, the planets circling, the mechanics of machines, all neat and reliable. People trusted those truths like they trusted the rising sun. To question them seemed as foolish as doubting the pull of gravity itself. And yet, in the solitude of that office, Einstein's thoughts moved in directions the old masters had never dared. He considered what it meant for light to move, how time itself might stretch or shrink depending on speed, how energy and matter might be 2 sides of the same mysterious coin. With pen scratching softly against paper, he rewrote the grammar of the universe. It did not look like revolution. There was no thunder, no proclamation from a mountaintop, just a man with a stack of papers, the lamplight glowing over his shoulder, and a mind unwilling to stay inside the familiar walls of certainty. The theories he wrote that year, special relativity, the idea of mass and energy entwined, would ripple outward, unsettling everything people thought they knew. Imagine holding a pocket watch in your hand, its steady tick a comfort against the chaos of life. Now imagine discovering that those ticks are not the same for everyone. That time itself bends, depending on where you stand and how fast you move. Imagine realizing that light, the same glow from a street lamp or the sun breaking through morning fog, does not behave like an obedient messenger, but more like a mystery that refuses to be pinned down. To ordinary people in 1905, the world still felt fixed. The train arrived by the station clock. The seasons rotated in dependable order. The moon rose with its old patience. But beneath that apparent stability, physics itself was changing its mind. It would take decades before Einstein's theories seeped fully into everyday awareness. Yet even in those early days, a quiet wonder began to stir. The universe was larger, stranger, more fluid than the human eye could see. Certainty, once thought solid as stone, revealed itself as sand shifting under the tide. For those who later reflected on this moment, it was as if the very floor of existence had tilted, revealing hidden rooms behind the familiar walls. The Newtonian world, with its straight lines and dependable laws, was not destroyed but expanded, stretched open to hold paradox, possibility, and awe. And so the early 1900s became not only a time of industry and invention, but also a time of wonder. Amid smokestacks and electric lights, amid the rattle of streetcars and the click of typewriters, human understanding itself was being reshaped. Even truth, it seemed, was not fixed forever. The thought was unsettling to some, liberating to others. But in the hush of that Swiss office, with the steady rhythm of a clock marking moments, a new century took its first intellectual breath. The world would never again be quite so certain. At the turn of the century, sickness still lingered like an unwelcome neighbor. In crowded neighborhoods and humid southern towns, disease could spread with alarming speed. The culprits were often invisible, though their signs were everywhere. Stagnant pools of water glistening under the sun, uncollected waste at the edge of alleys, the faint, sour odor of drains that could not keep up with the growth of the city. Families feared summer not only for its heat, but for the outbreaks it seemed to carry. Cholera, yellow fever, typhoid. Yet slowly, a new understanding began to change the way Americans looked at their surroundings. The lesson had been hard-earned, written in the suffering of workers who dug canals in tropical climates. In Panama, the promise of a mighty waterway had nearly collapsed under the weight of malaria and fever. But when the United States took up the project, doctors and engineers turned their attention not only to the locks and gates, but to the mosquitoes and swamps. By draining standing water, screening buildings, and fumigating homes, they discovered a truth both simple and powerful. Controlling the environment could control disease. That revelation did not stay in Panama. It traveled homeward, carried in reports, policies, and the growing conviction that health could be engineered just as surely as bridges or factories. Cities began to think differently about their streets and sewers. Sanitation was no longer an afterthought. It was the first line of defense. Imagine the sound of buckets sloshing down a row of tenements, water splashed against cobblestones to wash away refuse. Workers scattered lime on gutters to keep down the stench. Street cleaners, once a rare sight, became the daily guardians of urban life. Their brooms and carts might not have looked heroic, yet every sweep of the bristles helped carry death a little farther away. The air, once thick with the odor of decay, grew sharper with the bite of disinfectants, carbolic acid and other harsh scents that stung the nose but reassured the mind. In hospitals, doctors and nurses adopted cleaner practices. Hand washing, sterilization, and isolation wards spread from theory into routine. Life expectancy began, inch by inch, to stretch forward. Children who once might not have survived infancy grew into school-aged boys and girls. Families, still poor and crowded, found a measure of safety in the simplest of changes. Covered wells, cleaner milk, the disappearance of open cesspools. For those who lived through it, the difference was almost invisible at first. There were no great ceremonies to mark the draining of a puddle or the disinfecting of a hallway. But slowly, mortality tables began to bend. Streets that once carried funeral processions with unsettling frequency began to carry school children instead. It was progress of a quieter sort, not the kind that gleamed with steel or thrilled with the spark of invention, but the kind that took place in gutters, drains, and municipal budgets. Progress that began with the recognition that prevention could be as powerful as cure. In the rhythm of daily life, the sounds of cleanliness became as familiar as the clatter of wagons or the ring of church bells. A bucket of water, the scrape of a broom, the creak of a pump handle, each an act of ordinary labor. Yet together, they reshaped the destiny of a city. Sometimes progress does not look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like fewer funerals. Sometimes it sounds like silence, streets without the cough of disease, nights without the wail of mourning. In that silence, Americans found a new kind of hope, born not of machines or marvels, but of the simple work of keeping one another alive. Progress in the early 1900s was often measured in steel, in chimneys, in the thunder of machines that never seemed to rest. But for the men and women who stood in the shadows of those machines, progress was paid for in hours, in aching bones, and in wages that barely stretched to cover bread and coal. Factories did not sleep, and so the workers could not either. A shift might last 12 hours, sometimes 14, broken only by the clang of a bell or the brief pause to eat a cold meal from a tin pail. In Pennsylvania steel mills, the fires roared without pause, pouring out molten metal while men labored with faces slicked by heat. In textile mills across New England, the air was thick with lint, lungs tightening with every breath. On the railroads, crews wrestled with iron rails and the danger of machines that could kill with a single slip. The sounds of that life became a kind of clock, the shrill whistle announcing the start of a shift, the rhythmic hammer of presses, the cough that came at day's end from dust that clung to clothes and skin. Boots lined up by the door told their own story. Souls worn down from long days standing on concrete floors. Leather softened not by care, but by exhaustion. For families, the price was measured in coins, counted at the kitchen table by lamplight. A week's wages might vanish into rent, into food, into the endless demand for coal to keep a stove burning through winter. Children learned the art of stretching meals, watering soups, patching clothes, making something last until payday. The glow of prosperity that shone in city skylines rarely reached into the cramped rooms of tenements where workers returned each night. Unions tried to speak, but the response was often harsh. Strikes were met with lockouts, with guards, with violence. Men who gathered to demand safer conditions or shorter hours risked not only their jobs, but their lives. The names of places like Homestead and Ludlow would echo in the years to come, reminders that the cost of dignity was often paid in blood. And yet, families endured. Mothers took in laundry, sewing, boarders, whatever might bring a little extra into the household. Fathers carried their weariness quietly, setting down boots by the door, sitting at tables where coins were stacked like fragile hopes. Children grew up quickly, learning not only their letters at school, but the heavy arithmetic of survival. It was a contradiction that defined the age. America was becoming a nation of wealth, of industry, of invention. Fortunes were built in offices high above the city streets. fortunes that reshaped skylines and filled bank vaults. But beneath those towers, the very hands that lifted the nation upward were worn thin. Sometimes the truest sound of progress was not the whistle of a train or the hum of electricity, but the sigh of a man lowering himself into a chair after 14 hours, or the rustle of paper as a mother balanced a ledger of pennies and dimes. Progress is often celebrated in the language of triumph. But in these years, it carried another truth. It showed that prosperity can forget the hands that lifted it. That while machines grew louder and cities grew taller, the people who made it possible often lived in quiet struggle. And yet, even in that struggle, there was a kind of resilience. A candle lit at a window, a hymn sung softly on a Sunday, a child's laughter carrying through a crowded hallway. These small notes reminded families that life was more than labor, that even in the harshest arithmetic, hope still found its way onto the page. At the turn of the century, childhood was not always measured in play or in carefree afternoons. For so many, it was measured in shifts, in hours bent to the rhythm of a factory whistle or the steady swing of a pickaxe. Childhood was placed on the clock. In mill towns across New England, boys no older than 10 stood at looms taller than themselves, eyes straining against the blur of threads. Their small fingers were nimble, prized for slipping into tight spaces where a grown man's hand could never reach. But those same fingers bore cuts, scars, and sometimes worse when machinery caught hold. In coal towns of Pennsylvania, young boys crouched in breaker plants, their task to pluck stones from coal rushing past on conveyor belts. Dust filled their lungs before they ever knew the fullness of breath. In southern fields, children stooped beside parents, dragging sacks heavy with cotton or produce, the sun carving lines of labor across faces not yet grown. School was often a dream deferred. Desks sat empty, while fields and mills remained full. Some children tried to balance both worlds, classrooms in the morning, factory floors in the afternoon. But fatigue dulled lessons, and hunger made concentration impossible. A slate might remain blank, not because the child could not learn, but because there was no time to pick up the chalk. The arithmetic of survival took precedence over the arithmetic of numbers. Homes bore the weight of this sacrifice. Mothers stitched patches into worn clothes. Fathers counted coins by lamplight. And children, instead of sleeping soundly, often lay exhausted from a day of labor that should never have been theirs. Yet even in weariness, families clung to one another. Supper, however meager, was shared. Stories were told. Songs were hummed. A sense of belonging softened the harshness of necessity. The nation debated. Reformers called it a theft of innocence, while mill owners defended it as tradition, as necessity, as a way for families to survive. Laws were written, challenged, and rewritten, but in the early 1900s, progress was slow. 1 in 4 boys worked instead of learning. Childhood was shortened, not by choice, but by need. The sounds of this life remain vivid. The clatter of machinery too loud for small ears, the scrape of shovels against rock, the groan of carts too heavy for thin arms, and in the background, the persistent cough of lungs already worn. Yet there were also softer sounds, a lullaby sung over weary children, the rustle of pages when a family Bible was opened, the laughter that somehow still found its way between long hours. It was a generation that carried responsibility before it carried dreams. And yet, within that reality lay a quiet strength. For many, those early years of toil became the foundation of resilience, of determination, of the hope that the next generation might step out from under the clock and into a childhood of their own. When we look back now, the images come in contrast. On one side, the innocence of a child running barefoot through a meadow, chasing fireflies. On the other, that same child, now barefoot in a factory, sweeping floors slick with oil. Both were real. Both belonged to America at the dawn of the century. And though the laws would one day change, though reforms would slowly protect children from the harshest labor, the memory remains. Childhood on the clock was a story written in tired eyes, in calloused hands, and in mornings that came too soon. At the dawn of the 20th century, truth itself became a kind of lantern. America was racing forward, building taller, working longer, consuming more. Yet in the shadows of that progress lay secrets, injustices, and quiet cruelties. The ones who carried the lantern were called Muckrakers. Journalists and reformers, they stooped low into the grime of factories, tenements, and slaughterhouses, pulling into daylight what many preferred to keep hidden. Their words were not whispered. They thundered from the pages of magazines and newspapers, landing on kitchen tables and in barber shops, traveling by rail and post across the country. Readers who might never step into a meatpacking plant could suddenly smell the stench through printed lines, could feel the chill of rooms where unspeakable things were ground into food. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle did not merely describe a meal. It stripped away the illusion of safety, forcing America to taste the bitterness of neglect. President Theodore Roosevelt, restless and bold, saw both the anger and the opportunity. He called it the square deal, a promise that fairness should not belong only to the wealthy or the powerful, but also to the ordinary worker, the weary mother, the child who deserved more than a clock to measure his youth. Roosevelt's voice carried the energy of change. He stood against trusts that swallowed competition, against corporations that treated labor like fuel for the furnace. He was not against wealth, but he was against abuse. The square deal was more than a slogan. It became laws, written into the marrow of the nation's conscience. The Pure Food and Drug Act demanded honesty in what Americans consumed. Labels began to mean something real. The Meat Inspection Act gave federal eyes to places once hidden behind factory doors. For the first time, citizens could trust, at least a little, that what they placed on the family table would nourish rather than harm. But reform is never neat. It comes with resistance, with grumbling from those who profit in darkness, with long debates in Congress, with compromises that satisfy no one fully. Yet in those years, the momentum of outrage carried weight. Ordinary people discovered their voices could shape the laws that governed their daily bread, their medicine, their work. The soundscape of reform was distinct. Newspaper presses hammering late into the night, typewriter keys striking with urgency. The shuffle of pamphlets passed hand to hand in crowded halls. Courtrooms creaked with the weight of testimony, and on the streets, the murmur of conversations grew louder as people realized the private could become public. The hidden could be named, and the named could be changed. The muckrakers were not saints. Some exaggerated, Some dramatized, some sought fame, but collectively, they forced the nation to look at itself. And once a mirror is lifted, it is hard to turn away. Looking back now, there is a sense of gratitude. Without their stubborn pens, the meal on the table, the pill in the cabinet, the hours at the factory might have remained unguarded, unregulated, unsafe. Outrage, in its sharpest form, became a kind of medicine. It stung, but it healed. The square deal was not the end of reform. It was a beginning, a signal that progress did not only mean more machines, more money, or more miles of rail. It meant fairness, balance, and a willingness to protect the human heart of the nation. And in that moment, America discovered that even in the grime of its own making, light could still enter. At the turn of the 20th century, America was a nation divided not only by geography or wealth, but by something more silent and more enduring: the color line. It was not drawn on maps, but on doors, in train cars, in schools, and in the fragile hopes of those who walked beneath its shadow. The phrase, "separate but equal," had been written into law after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. But everyone knew the truth. Separation was real. Equality was not. Signs on water fountains, restaurants, and railway coaches spoke without speaking. They told millions of citizens where they could sit, where they could eat, where they could drink, where they could dream. The daily ritual of being told no wore as heavy on the heart as any chain. For African Americans in the South, life expectancy was a measure of injustice. On average, a black man or woman might expect only 33 years of life, while their white neighbors could hope for nearly 50. It was more than numbers. It was nights cut short, mothers lost too soon, children left behind before they had grown tall. The terror was not abstract. It lived in the form of lynchings, horrifying public spectacles meant to send a message. They were not only acts of violence, but of intimidation, reminders that the color line was enforced not just by law, but by fear. A newspaper might quietly record the event, or sometimes not at all. Yet in the neighborhoods where they occurred, the memory echoed for generations. And yet, in the midst of these cruelties, there was resilience. In black churches, voices rose in hymn, carrying both sorrow and hope in their harmonies. In schoolrooms, chalk squeaked across blackboards as teachers taught children to read words that could not be taken from them. Families gathered on porches in the evening, sharing food, stories, and laughter. Acts of love and defiance against a world that tried to make them small. The weight of discrimination was constant, but so was the courage to endure. To walk with dignity, to sing with conviction, to teach the next generation meant keeping a lamp lit against the wind. Even when the world tried to dim it, the flame refused to go out. Elsewhere in the nation, some looked on with indifference. Others whispered that things would never change. But voices were already stirring. Leaders, writers, and communities who would not accept a nation forever split along the color line. Their efforts were the first notes of a longer song, one that would build across decades into the music of the civil rights movement. Looking back from today, the early 1900s seem heavy with contradictions. America celebrated progress, invention, and expansion, yet it tolerated laws that diminished millions of its own people. But within that contradiction lay a truth. Progress is not only the story of machines and marvels, but of human hearts insisting on fairness. The color line was real. It scarred families and shaped lives. Yet even in its shadow, there were hands clasped in prayer, voices raised in song, and communities choosing hope. Courage, quiet and persistent, kept its lamp lit in the wind, guiding America toward a day when separation would no longer be its creed. In the early years of the new century, a question hovered over America, unspoken in some places, loudly pressed in others: who truly belonged? The laws had drawn lines. The color of one's skin or the weight of one's accent often decided how far one could walk, where one could stand, and what doors remained closed. Yet even as the nation tried to seal its divisions into permanence, there were voices that refused to wait. In quiet classrooms and on public platforms, men and women rose to say that dignity was not a favor to be granted, but a birthright. Booker T. Washington, with his calm manner and practical mind, urged patience and skill. He believed that through education, through mastering a trade and building economic strength, the walls of prejudice might someday crack. His speeches reached both black and white audiences, planting seeds of self-reliance in soil that often seemed barren. Others felt the time for patience had passed. W.E.B. Du Bois, scholar and writer, spoke of a talented 10th. Leaders who would guide the way by claiming the rights that had been promised but not delivered. He did not look to wait for slow mercy. He called instead for action, for recognition, for equality not tomorrow, but now. His words carried urgency, echoing in parlors, church basements, and lecture halls. By 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had formed. Its founders, black and white together, understood that change would not arrive by silence. Pamphlets were printed, meetings were held, courtrooms would be tested. The NAACP became a vessel for those who could not wait, who would not surrender to a life measured by segregation's cruel arithmetic. At the same time, the National Urban League worked on the ground, helping families who moved northward in search of work and a measure of freedom. It was there to ease the crossing from field to factory, from rural poverty to fragile opportunity. While speeches stirred hearts, these organizations tried to steady hands, placing tools and textbooks in them, ensuring that progress was not only a dream, but a daily practice. The sounds of this era still linger in memory. Chalk dust shaken from an eraser as a teacher prepared another lesson for children who would inherit the fight. The rustle of pamphlets folded into coat pockets, carried on trains, passed hand to hand. The hum of voices gathering in church halls, singing hymns not only to God, but to the promise of justice. For those who lived under the weight of the color line, progress was not yet visible, but they felt it, like a tremor beneath the ground before an earthquake. Each speech, each class, each printed page was a footstep, small perhaps, but moving steadily forward. Together, those footsteps began to answer the century's question. The path was long, and it would be decades before the nation saw laws overturned and rights affirmed. Yet here, in the dawn of the 1900s, the journey had already begun. These voices, insistent and unyielding, told America that belonging could not be postponed forever. The century had asked who was part of the nation's promise, and the answer arrived, clear and steady, in the footsteps of those who would not wait. Progress in the early 1900s often meant towering steel, glowing bulbs, and voices carried across oceans. But in most homes, progress still looked like suds, steam, and calloused hands. The housework of living was not a passing detail. It was the rhythm of daily existence. In kitchens, washboards leaned against tin basins, and water had to be hauled in bucket by bucket. A bar of lye soap sat by the sink, rough to the touch, stripping dirt as surely as it stripped skin. Monday was wash day in many homes, and the sight of clotheslines sagging with heavy garments became a familiar skyline of its own. Each shirt and sheet held the scent of hard labor, the slap of fabric against stone, the sound of dripping water hitting the floorboards. Churning butter was not a quaint exercise. It was breakfast, it was supper, it was survival. The steady rhythm of a wooden dasher moving through cream was the quiet percussion of the household. Children often took turns, shoulders aching, until the pale liquid thickened into golden substance. On the table, that butter was more than food. It was proof of effort, of time transformed into something nourishing. Floors were scrubbed on hands and knees, wooden planks brightened with elbow grease. Knees pressed into boards, hands red from soap and water. Women often rose from their tasks with stiff backs and damp hems. A clean floor was not just a matter of pride. It was the difference between sickness and health in homes where dust and dampness could settle deep into lungs. Cooking itself was a ceremony of labor. There were no electric mixers, no refrigerators humming in the background. Bread dough was worked by hand, biscuits cut with jars, vegetables peeled slowly by lamplight. Heat came from wood or coal stoves, and keeping them lit required constant attention. A pot left untended could mean not just a spoiled meal, but wasted fuel, a resource too precious to lose. Children often joined in these endless tasks. A girl might be asked to stir a pot while her mother scrubbed, a boy sent to fetch water from a pump or wood from a pile outside. Small chores were not tokens of discipline. They were necessities. Each hand, no matter how young, carried part of the family's weight. And yet, within this labor, there was intimacy. Supper laid out on a rough-hewn table carried the taste of love and persistence. A basin of clean clothes, folded neatly by the fire, spoke of sacrifice. Even the hiss of a kettle or the squeak of a drying board was part of a symphony, ordinary, repetitive, but steady, like the heartbeat of home. It is easy now, with our machines and conveniences, to forget that housework once meant hours spent just to make the day livable. But for families of the early 1900s, it was the texture of life. Every garment, every dish, every sweep of a broom told a quiet story of effort turned into comfort. The housework of living was not glamorous, and it often went unnoticed by history's grand narratives. But it was here, in these kitchens and parlors, on these scrubbed floors and crowded clotheslines, that the foundation of daily life was built. Progress was measured not only in factories and inventions, but in the small mercies of a clean shirt, a warm meal, and a family gathered around the table at the end of a long day. In those ordinary tasks lived a truth. Convenience, when it finally came, was not just technology. It was time. Time returned to mothers, fathers, and children. Time to rest, to dream, to sit together after the day's labor had ended. And that time, as much as any invention, was the real gift of progress. Across the farmlands and small towns of early 20th century America, education often fit inside 4 simple walls. A one-room schoolhouse stood at both classroom and community anchor, plain in structure, but immense in its purpose. Wooden clapboards weathered by wind and rain, a coal stove planted at the center, and rows of benches carved with initials long since forgotten. It was in these modest spaces that the futures of countless children took shape. Students of every age gathered beneath the same roof. The youngest, barely tall enough to see over their desks, sat near the front, slate boards balanced on their laps. Teenagers, already carrying the weight of farm chores or mill shifts, leaned in the back, reciting lessons while keeping an eye on the clock. The mix was uneven, but so was life itself. Learning happened in layers, older children helping the younger, repetition serving as the greatest teacher. The teacher was often young, sometimes not much older than her oldest students. She came armed with little more than chalk, a blackboard, and the will to see minds grow where resources were thin. Payment might arrive in coins, but just as often in the form of eggs, firewood, or a basket of apples left on her desk. Respect was her true wage, and the long-lasting gratitude of her pupils, a currency more valuable than dollars. The rhythm of the day was simple. A bell rang, clear and bright against the countryside, and lessons began. Reading aloud from McGuffey readers, practicing sums on slate, memorizing lines of history and scripture. The soundscape was a blend of coal crackling in the stove, the faint squeak of chalk, and voices overlapping as multiplication tables met spelling lists. Discipline was gentle but firm, a reminder to sit straighter, to speak clearer, to pay attention even when the body was weary. Outside the windows, fields stretched endlessly. Many children walked miles each morning, boots muddy from farm paths or shoes thin from too much use. Winter brought frost-bitten fingers thawed near the stove. Summer carried the smell of cut hay drifting through open doors. School was not a luxury. It was a pause in the cycle of labor, a chance to glimpse a world beyond the fields, the mines, or the factories waiting outside. For families, education represented hope, even when only offered in scraps. Parents knew the strength of a written word, the possibility hidden in the ability to read a contract, tally accounts, or pen a letter. A single room of learning could open doors far wider than its own. Literacy rates climbed, not because the buildings were grand or the books plentiful, but because the determination of students and teachers refused to yield. And so, the one-room schoolhouse became more than a place of instruction. It was a vessel for dreams. A boy who read by lantern light after chores might one day lead a town meeting. A girl who practiced penmanship between farm duties might become the steady hand of a nurse or teacher herself. Out of modest desks and simple chalkboards rose futures as boundless as the horizon outside. Looking back now, it is tempting to see only the hardships, the drafty walls, the scarcity of supplies, the endless repetition of lessons. Yet beneath those conditions lived a quiet miracle. Children learned. They carried words and numbers home into families who had never held them before. They transformed small spaces into vast worlds of possibility. The one-room schoolhouse was never just a building. It was the seed of progress, planted in soil both rich and poor. Its walls may have been humble, but its legacy was enormous. From those creaking benches and coal-smudged stoves, generations found the courage to imagine more. And in that imagining, America itself grew. As the sun dipped beyond the rooftops, a new kind of magic awakened in the early 1900s. Cities that had once gone dark at twilight now glittered like fields of stars, man-made and dazzling. For ordinary Americans, this glow promised more than light. It promised escape. At Coney Island, 1,000,000 bulbs burned against the Atlantic sky. Walkways shimmered with golden arches of electricity, drawing crowds by the tens of thousands. Families in Sunday clothes wandered wide-eyed, as if they had stepped into another world. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and salt water, the distant cry of carnival barkers, the grinding music of carousel organs. Children tugged at their parents' hands, eager to ride wooden horses that galloped in endless circles under the blaze of electric suns. For a nickel, wonder itself could be purchased. Amusement parks and carnivals weren't the only spectacles. Entertainment took root everywhere, inside theaters, in open fields, and in the hearts of bustling cities. Nickelodeons, humble storefronts with painted signs, invited patrons to drop a coin and sit in the dark. There, on flickering screens, trains raced toward the audience, thieves held up passengers, and stories unfolded without words. The great train robbery in 1903 startled and thrilled those who saw it. A simple, moving picture could leave a room gasping, laughing, or even ducking in surprise. For people who had grown up with lantern light and still photographs, it was nothing short of astonishing. Sports, too, carried a new rhythm. Baseball, long played on dusty diamonds, began to capture the nation's heart as the first World Series was held in 1903. Crowds packed wooden bleachers, their cheers carrying over fields and fences. Boxing matches drew spectators to smoky halls, where every punch echoed like a drumbeat of glory and survival. Evenings filled with contests of strength and skill, giving working families something to dream about beyond the mill whistle and the ledger book. Music stitched itself into the fabric of these nights. Ragtime, syncopated and sly, spilled from pianos in saloons and parlors. Its playful rhythms carried hints of jazz, a sound still unborn, but waiting just around the corner. To hear it was to feel the world quicken, to sense that something bold, bright, and utterly new was rising from the American spirit. Couples danced in cramped halls, shoes tapping against wooden floors, laughter carried with the notes, and always there was light. Electric bulbs tracing outlines of theaters, glowing signs above vaudeville houses, sparks of brightness that seemed to compete with the moon itself. Against this backdrop, ordinary Americans found themselves transformed. A factory worker became an audience member. A farmer's daughter became a dancer. A child became a dreamer staring at flickering images larger than life. The beauty of it all was its price. Just a nickel. A small coin worn smooth from countless pockets, enough to unlock a few hours of joy, of escape, of wonder. In those moments, class and hardship blurred. Inside the glowing lights of amusement parks, theaters, and ballparks, people were not merely surviving. they were living. Looking back now, these electric nights seem fragile, almost quaint. Yet, to those who stood beneath the bulbs or sat before the silver screen, they were nothing less than miracles. They carried the promise that even in an uncertain century, joy could be manufactured, shared, and remembered. In the early 1900s, dreams were no longer confined to sleep. They flickered on screens, spun on carousels, roared from stadiums, and leapt from piano keys. And all it cost was a nickel. As the 20th century began to find its rhythm, America stood at a crossroads not only within its borders, but upon the wider world stage. For decades, the nation had been largely content to look inward, to build its farms, its railroads, its factories, and its towns. But by the early 1900s, something in its posture began to shift. The country lifted its gaze across oceans and continents, curious, ambitious, and uncertain of what role it might play beyond its shores. The signs were everywhere. In 1898, the Spanish-American War had pulled America into the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, planting a flag far from its own soil. By the new century, the Philippines remained both a proud acquisition and a troubling question, an island chain both governed and resented, a reminder that power is never simple. In classrooms and parlors, Americans debated what it meant to extend freedom while holding territories that had not asked for it. In China, the Boxer Rebellion revealed the fragility of an empire and the hunger of foreign powers. American troops, shoulder to shoulder with Europeans, marched under banners that claimed to protect commerce and missionaries, but also announced a new presence. The phrase "open door" became a guiding principle: trade without exclusion, a policy of opportunity over conquest. Yet behind the polite language of diplomacy, there was steel. The United States was no longer content to be a bystander. Closer to home, tragedy reshaped the presidency. In 1901, an assassin's bullet ended William McKinley's steady hand, and into the breach stepped Theodore Roosevelt, a man young, brash, and unafraid to shout where others whispered. Roosevelt believed in muscle and vision. Under his eye, the great white fleet steamed across the seas, battleships painted bright, their passage less about war than about display. To watch them sail into foreign harbors was to see America flex its growing strength, to let the world know it had arrived. And then there was the Canal. The dream of linking the Atlantic to the Pacific had haunted engineers for centuries, but at last the pieces fell into American hands. In Panama, sweat and sickness turned soil to graveyards, but progress inched forward with every cut of earth. The sluice gates groaned, the jungle bent, and with time the oceans would join, shrinking the world and announcing that American determination could move mountains, or at least carve through them. Beyond these headlines, ordinary Americans read newspapers with growing curiosity about far-off places. Harbor horns echoed with the arrival of goods from distant markets. Maps were no longer only schoolroom decorations, but living documents, marked by stories of fleets, treaties, and telegrams. The sense was unmistakable. America was stepping outward, and in doing so, it was learning the weight of influence. Yet power is heavy. It does not rest easily on young shoulders. The nation's ambition carried questions of justice, of morality, of purpose. Could a republic born in revolution carry an empire without losing itself? Could a people who prized liberty reconcile it with the governance of others? In quiet kitchens and on courthouse steps, those questions stirred as surely as they did in Washington. Looking back, one sees not certainty, but motion. Ships leaving harbors, ink drying on treaties, voices raised in both pride and protest. The early 1900s were not only about steel and light, but about a nation realizing it was no longer an island unto itself. The world's fuse was shortening, Japan humbling Russia, Europe moving toward tension, alliances hardening like steel rails. America's outward gaze would soon meet storms it could not avoid, but for a moment, there was also wonder. Wonder at a country finding its place among nations, testing its strength, and discovering that the horizon was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The day has finally slipped into night. The clamor of factories has quieted, and the streets, so alive only hours ago, now rest under the glow of faint lamps. A man walks slowly through the city, his footsteps softened by the hush of cobblestones dampened with evening rain. He passes the streetcar barn where the last trolley rests, its wheels cooling, the echo of the day's journeys still lingering in the rafters. Down the block, a bakery closes its doors. The smell of warm bread fades into the night air, drifting toward alleys where cats slink and shadows stretch. In a window not far away, a family gathers at a simple table. Their faces are touched by the glow of electric light, still new, still miraculous, while voices rise and fall in gentle rhythm over supper. Outside, the watcher hears not their words, but the music of togetherness, the sound of life's smallest comforts carrying into the dark. These scenes repeat across countless towns and cities. A lamp turned low in a farmhouse kitchen, a teacher stacking slates in a one-room schoolhouse, a boy polishing boots for the morning shift, a girl placing her Kodak prints carefully back in an envelope to be shown again on Sunday. The century, with all its contradictions, has left 1,000 such impressions, tucked into corners both bright and shadowed. The soundscape of this time is subtle but vivid. The distant whistle of a train rolling through the countryside, carrying letters and hopes, the soft patter of rain on roofs and awnings, the faint winding down of a phonograph as its needle slows, leaving behind a silence that is not empty, but full of rest, of reflection, of the promise of tomorrow. For those who lived then, the world felt vast yet intimate. The ocean was a barrier, but one that telegraphs had begun to cross. Cities felt immense, but still close enough that neighbors leaned over fences to share stories. It was a time balanced between hardship and hope, between the weight of labor and the lightness of discovery. Each night ended not with certainty, but with endurance, the quiet assurance that morning would come, and with it, another chance to continue. Now, more than a century later, these echoes still carry. The factory whistle may no longer blow, and the trolleys may rest as relics in museums, but the human thread remains unbroken. The longing for safety, for family, for meaning in the small rituals of life, these remain timeless. And so, as we close tonight's story, let the images linger gently in your mind. The lamplight glowing on a quiet street, the smell of bread fading into evening air, the sound of soft rain beginning to fall. Imagine yourself walking that same route home, your steps slow, your thoughts wandering, your heart carrying both the burdens and the hopes of the day. Because history is not only found in books and monuments, it lives in these quiet details, in the soft moments that once belonged to ordinary people. They remind us that the past is never gone. It waits quietly, like a lamp still glowing in a window, guiding us back to the shared story of who we are. And now, dear listener, it is time to rest. Tomorrow will come either way. Tonight, let the old world and the new share your dreams. Let the voices of the past become a lullaby, carrying you gently into sleep. Thank you for joining me here at Sleepytown Radio, where we tell quiet stories for quiet hearts. If this journey brought you comfort, I invite you to subscribe, to share your thoughts in the comments, and to pass these stories along to someone who might also need a little peace at the end of the day. Your support keeps these stories alive, and I'm grateful for each of you who chooses to walk this road with us. So close your eyes now. Let the sound of the rain, the distant train, and the quiet turning of another page in time guide you toward rest. Good night and sweet dreams.